So one of the greatest moments in the medieval world has to be Henry V's Agincourt campaign in 1415, and while the battle itself has been heavily romanticised, it was the campaign which led us there which saw Henry cross a fine line between genius and madman. Since ascending to the throne in 1413, Henry had been frothing at the seams for a chance to win a magnificent victory on the battlefield to show that his reign was blessed in the eyes of God and he wasn't just some pretender to the crown that his father usurped in 1399. However, the war with France was currently at a lull period, and Henry couldn't just waltz in with a massive army and shed loads of Christian blood without good cause, so he sent France a list of the most outrageous demands possible, which involved him owning more of France than France itself, which was of course rejected, so Henry was like, well, we have to go to war with them now, we have no other choice. Henry bankrupted the kingdom preparing for his French invasion. However, there was no better time to strike, as France was ruled by a madman who believed he was made of glass and was in a state of civil war between rival royal houses, as well as Henry having secret agreements with the Duke of Brittany and Duke of Burgundy not to impede him if he did invade. Henry set sail in August 1415 even after numerous setbacks and a foiled conspiracy theory to overthrow him as king, and laid siege to the small town of Harfleur, only held by a few hundred fighting men, compared to Henry's 12,000 going up to 15,000, including all the camp followers. Henry's supposed quick siege turned into a month-long one as he lost 1,500 men to the bloody flux or dysentery due to insanitary conditions, as well as needing 1,200 men to garrison the shithole which was now Harfleur after the English cannons had finished with it. At this point the French were gathering a huge army at Rouen to fight the English, and Henry sent a 1v1 invitation cage match to the French Dauphin to decide who was the rightful king of France, which was sadly refused, but Henry still wanted his battlefield victory to show he was God's chosen, and now he had a big decision to make. Marching towards the French capital of Paris was certain suicide, as he could get trapped within France, and he couldn't turn back now with all the money and planning he had done, so he probably done what he always intended to do and marched towards English-held Calais. While it was never certain what Henry would do after Harfleur, every step of the way, including planning, he had been copying his great-grandfather's example, Edward III in his Cressy campaign, and he would probably cross where his granddaddy did across the Somme at Blanchardtec. Only packing enough supplies for the 8-day march to Calais, Henry set off avoiding all major towns. However, the French also had access to history books and knew Henry was probably going to try and cross somewhere up here, the same place Edward III did, and they had got there first, and now Henry had the opportunity to fight at the Blanchardtec as his grandfather did. However, he turned inwards as fighting there would be certain suicide. As the English turned deeper into France looking for an unguarded river crossing, those 8 days of supplies were beginning to grow thin as Henry's men began dropping to starvation as well as the lingering dysentery from Harfleur, and he was lucky his men couldn't desert him as he was so deep into enemy territory as he led them to what looked like was certain death. The French shadowed Henry at every move and they only lost track of him as he turned inwards towards land, and he soon heard of a river crossing that was unguarded just upstream, but whatever morale boost the English got from crossing the river was soon dashed as they saw the entire French army's tracks in the mud who had gotten ahead of them and now blocked the road to Calais. Henry would finally get the battle he so desperately craved. So believe it or not, the French actually won the 100 Years' War against the brilliance and might of the English longbow. Unbelievable, I know. The year is 1453 and the English are holding on to territories in France by a thread, but the French are out for blood, determined to kick these noncy-poncy tea drinkers out of their cheese-eating lands. Edward III, the Black Prince, Henry V, all heroes of valiant English victories against the French, are now lying dead in the ground, and Henry VI holds the crown of England, someone who needs a sex coach to satisfy his wife and prefers poetry to the art of war. An absolute disaster for a medieval king. In 1451, France captured Bordeaux in English-held Gascony, a territory they had held for over 300 years, and the English subjects were now like, come save us English boys, because you're imposed lower taxes on us, but Henry VI certainly wasn't going to leave his Legos to come fight a war. So Henry sent one of the finest military commanders in England instead, John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, who was 66 and ready for some pensioning and pounding, and soon retook the town with 3,000 men. The French king, Charles VII, was like, nah mate, we're gonna smash these English boys, counter-attacking and invading Guyenne with 3 separate armies, first laying siege to Castillon, which was 40 miles east of Bordeaux, and Big John Talbot sent a force of roughly 1,300 men to relieve the siege. Pensioner boy Talbot pressed on towards the French encampment, believing reinforcements would arrive soon, winning a victory against a small French detachment along the way, and now rumour had it that the French were now retreating. Although they weren't, it was just some camp followers moving away from the camp. Big John launched his attack straight away on the French encampment. However, he wasn't allowed to join the attack or wear any armour due to previous agreements with the French when he was held captive. He pushed his 1,300 men towards a heavily fortified French encampment, which held around 300 cannons and 8,000 more soldiers. The cannons cut through the English lines like a spoon to hot butter, but Big John held his order as his pride and honour was at stake, with his reinforcements soon arriving shortly after and them suffering the same fate of his initial troops of being absolutely fucked. Against all odds, the English did manage to hold. That was until 1,000 cavalry come charging into their right flank, forcing them to retreat. And Big John's horse was struck by a cannonball, pinning him down, before a French archer came and finished him off with an axe. The French now besieged Castillon, forcing them into a surrender, taking around 5,000 Anglo-Gascon men prisoner, and soon, 3 months later, taking control of English-held Gascony as Bordeaux fell. Although it wasn't known at the time, this was the end of one of the most important conflicts of the Middle Ages in the 100 Years' War. Rumour has it that upon hearing the news of all English-held lands lost in France, bar Calais, Henry VI had a mental collapse leading to a coma, which led to an arguably even more important conflict in British history, the Wars of the Roses. So in 1363, King Edward III of England declared that every able-bodied man learn and practice archeries on Sundays and holidays, taking priority over other games and sports. The reason being is that the Kingdom of England was running out of capable men able to use the burly beast that was the English longbow, which required years of training and experience to meet the King's high standards to be able to be used in his war machine against the cheese munchers across the Channel. The 6-foot longbows with draw weights of roughly 120 to 170 pounds took years of experience to be able to accurately hit a man-sized target roughly 200 to 300 metres away, and they had to do this 10 to 12 times a minute, an extremely demanding physical feat, all while angry Frenchmen are charging towards you looking to stick a sword through your skull. All this put immense strain on the body, with the skeletons of longbowmen found with overdeveloped shoulders and arms to compensate for the years of practice starting at a young age at around roughly 14 or 15. The longbow had been crucial to English victories at Halidon Hill in 1333, Sluys in 1340 and Cressy in 1346. However, in recruitment it seemed that some commanders had issues with the physique of the men they were getting, or they weren't able to find any men at all for the role. In order to fill this void in the early stages of the 100 Years' War, English campaigns into France saw the recruitment of criminals. These sensitised men who were better off inflicting violence on the French than they were staying at home taking up prison space. Edward's declaration in 1363 came at a time of peace with France, with many considering the golden age of archery to be over. But the political situation in France was extremely fragile and war could break out again at any minute, so having a large pool of longbowmen to recruit from was extremely beneficial for Edward. By the time the Battle of Agincourt rolled around in 1415, King Henry V of England took with him roughly 3 million arrows on campaign, in which he commissioned 13 fletchers to do. However, this would have taken them 40 years of work, but here comes another benefit of the 1363 declaration. The mandatory practice of archery meant bows and arrows were produced in times of peace as well as war, and in 1357 as well as 1369 proclamations were made making it illegal to export any bows and arrows from England, as well as archers not being allowed to leave the country in 1365 without a royal pardon. In 1541, an Act of Parliament made it mandatory for every male 14 to 60 to own bow and arrows for shooting. However, in 1845, this penalty for not owning one was removed. So believe it or not, there's actually a few moments in history where the English actually lost the battle. To the French as well. I couldn't quite believe it either, but on June the 18th, 1429, an English army got reverse Agincourted by the French at the Battle of Patay, showing the real limitations of the English longbow. After teenage prodigy Joan of Arc had lifted the siege of Orleans in May 1429, the English army now retreated along the Loire River. Joan led a devastating campaign along the Loire River, beating the English at every turn and recapturing French strongholds and crossing points. After the defeat of Orleans, an English force set off from Paris of roughly 5,000 men to join up with other English survivors and relieve some of the tensions. At this point, Joan and her army would be sieging the city of Beaugency, and their force there was unaware that any English relief force was on the way, so they surrendered the city. The English force, now learning of the surrender, decided to head back up to Paris that way, which is not shown on the map, and Joan ordered 1,500 of her finest vanguard to pursue them. Upon learning of the French pursuit, the English set up their archers to block the French path and ambush them. However, in stark contrast to the forces at Agincourt, this English army was undisciplined and took far too long to set up, and only had around 500 archers out of their total force of 5,000. Before consolidating their position and setting up defences such as sharpened stakes to dissuade cavalry, the English accidentally revealed their position to the French. A lone stag had wandered onto the field, and the English archers let up a magnificent hunting cry, not realising that the French scouts were just around the corner. The French cavalry, learning of the English position, swiftly charged them, outflanking them and absolutely slaughtering them. The French men-at-arms quickly followed their cavalry in and made light work of the English army that was extremely disorganised. The terrain that played such a crucial role at the Battle of Agincourt offered them no protection here, as it said the outcome of the battle was decided in only a few minutes. The vulnerability of the longbow to a flanking cavalry charge had been horrendously exposed here. The French only lost around 100 men out of 1,500, whereas the English saw half of their 5,000 strong army killed or captured. The French victory at Patay saw the conclusion of Joan of Arc's Loire campaign, where the English would never recover such a strong position in France again. So in June 1340, England and France clashed in a naval battle just off the coast of Flanders that would act as spectacular foreplay for one of the most iconic engagements of the medieval period, as they both went toe-to-toe for the honour of the French crown. King Edward III of England planned to land his force around the city of Bruges to support his Flemish allies and open up a new offensive against the French, with his force consisting of around 2,300 men, split evenly between longbowmen and men-at-arms, that was carried across the Channel in around 120 ships. However, compared to France, England didn't have a dedicated navy and were using merchant ships known as cogs that had been converted with the addition of wooden castles on top of the ships, so archers could rain down arrows from above. France, on the other hand, had galleys, which had long been in use in the Mediterranean theatre of war and were excellent at ship-to-ship engagements and raiding due to their high manoeuvrability. Before Edward left England, rumour began circulating that the French had caught wind of the English's plans and were ready to intercept them and destroy them in a major sea battle with over double the amount of English ships, and many advised Edward to delay the crossing. Edward had already delayed enough in assembling his force, and he was to wait no longer, and he trusted his battle-hardened soldiers after their previous wars with Scotland. He also knew that the French ships were manned by sailors with little to no battlefield experience, and it was vital that he engaged them on his terms. On the 24th of June, the French fleet was spotted outside the city of Sluys, where they were bound together in chains, almost creating a floating castle. However, they were hamstrung by the lack of leadership, with some commanders saying that they should break chains and advance on the English, and others saying they should maintain a solid defence. Edward seized the moments and ordered his ships to attack the French flanks in groups of three, two packed with archers and the other with men-at-arms, and their high manoeuvrability proved effective as they used grappling hooks to engage enemy vessels. Many French in the front lines were brutally slaughtered or captured as they couldn't escape their ships, and those in the back lines saw this happening, began to panic, and found that the only way they could escape their ships was to jump into the sea. The battle lasted from midday until nightfall, where Edward was wounded in the leg with a crossbow bolt. However, he claimed a remarkable victory which no one expected. The English lost only around 500 men and 2 ships, compared to the French who had over 150 captured and casualties upward of 20,000, with most drowning in their armour as they were unable to swim, like this chap here. The French who did manage to make it ashore though were clubbed to death by Flemish spectators, with the English joking that if the fish were given the ability to speak, that's so large the amount of French that drowned, they would speak in French because of how many they'd eaten.